This episode explores the industrializing United States, and particularly that it industrializes mostly in the north. Now, the other countries that are industrializing in this period are England and France, and so this is the United States' first industrial revolution. And that's what we're looking at today, so let's get started. I wanted to just look at a few maps that illustrate things about the United States first. This map shows you the movement westward of the center of the population. That means with each date and with each green mark, the half of the population lived to the east of it and the other half lived to the west. So you can see in the 1800s that it was right there just at where Washington, D.C. is today. So half of the U.S. population was living basically on the very eastern coast, and the other half was living anywhere all the way to the Mississippi. And then very quickly you can see at 1820 as it moves over to 1840. And then with the Civil War, which is where we are headed, it's at Cincinnati, Ohio, basically, but right in the center of Ohio is the center of the population. Again, half of the population living to the east of that triangle for 1860 and half of the population living to the west. So that's an interesting thing. It basically tells you that all of the population was on the east coast. Also, for the United States, and in terms of industrialization, transportation is going to be important, we'll see. And they have they have completed a road, and it's called the Cumberland Road, and you can see it in red here. The first connections were made a little bit earlier, but they wanted to basically connect Cumberland with Vandalia over here. But really the upshot of it was from Baltimore to St. Louis there was road that could be traveled in order to transport goods. In addition to roads, the United States was building, as many other European states were also, canal systems, and the most well-known of the canal systems is the Erie Canal, and here it is. It will connect this Hudson River that goes up from New York all the way up to Albany, and then the Erie Canal is the dark blue. It goes straight across all the way into Buffalo and Lake Erie. And so water traffic, boats could go from Lake Erie all the way to Albany and then down to New York, and so transport goods in that fashion. And you can see too that they built canals onto the Erie Canal so they could get goods from all over the upstate New York region into New York. But it went further than that, because the Lake Erie could be connected to all the other lakes, and then therefore Chicago, and that will become an even more important thing. In addition to the Erie Canal, you want to see this is 1840 up here, and the Erie Canal is marked again from Albany to Buffalo, but they had many other canals as well, connecting the Great Lakes region to the Ohio and then the Mississippi River. So you can see all these other canals that were connecting rivers and waterways up so that they could get them to the East Coast and or down the Mississippi River. So all of these maps are showing you that the transportation systems in the north, and this is not exaggerating things because the south was not developing these things, were becoming very interconnected. This is a map of the railroads, and you want to see that in 1850 there's only 3,000 miles of railroad, and it's represented in the black here, which is just on the edge, very heavily done actually though up in the Boston area, but not connecting the old Northwest, which is out here in the Great Lakes region, just west of the Great Lakes region, with New York ultimately, but also Philadelphia and Baltimore. And that was going to be the big connection, because then you could get goods from these great farmlands that were in the old Northwest all the way up through the lakes, across the Erie Canal, and then down into New York. And that was the important connection. So here it tells you that there were 3,000 miles of railroad in 1850, and whoo, what a boom, 30,000 miles in 1860. And the other thing that you can see from this map is that the South has almost no railroads, very few railroads. So you can see that the North was heavily investing in railroad and railroad construction so that its markets were all connected up. The South was much less likely and more agrarian and not building an industrial sector. So there were less railroads that they built. All right, so let's now talk about industrialization and what it takes for industrialization, because that's an interesting question, and the fact that the United States is going through an industrialization at the beginning of the 19th century really presses what does it take to industrialize. First, you need to have a guarantee of private property and a contract tradition, and we've talked about that already. The Constitution is one of those contracts, and anything is a contract, and especially in a purchase or sale of something. So, of course, property is bound by contracts in the United States today, but also back then, and those contracts would hold in law courts, and that's what's important about it, that your private property is protected by a government, and that government is stable. You also need a system for financing things, i.e. you need banks, and then also a system by which investment banking can go on. So the United States banking system was growing as well. It had some peculiarities, but we don't need to talk about those. At least they did have banks, which allowed people to store and protect their money and their finances, and also provided a place for borrowing money so that they could engage in large enterprises. You also need markets to sell to. Now, the United States then was building, of course, its internal markets, but it was also cultivating markets, international markets in Europe and then in Asia as well, and that was a big direction to go for the United States, is to build its Asian markets. And so it did have great potential for expanding markets, but in the early 19th century they were good as it was, so that the North was really going through a period of prosperity and thus industrialization. For industrialization, you also need a new source of power so that machinery could help to augment production processes. And we'll see what that power was in the United States. Some of you can probably guess what it was. Transportation needs to improve, and we just looked at maps that showed us the improvement of transportation and the movement of population. You need a culture that fosters entrepreneurship. So in the United States in particular, there was a big push for people, partly because of private property being protected. It also meant that your own labor and your own skills were protected as well. But lots of incentive culturally to build your own business and to make your own way in the world, whether you are an entrepreneur and a small farmer or whether you were an entrepreneur and a large business owner. In addition, innovation has to be part of the culture, and science is very important in that process. So science and innovation have to be part of the culture of business, and that would actually, the important thing is that you marry science to business. And so in the United States as well, in the early 19th century, the West, England even more so, but science was married to business, and innovation then could take place in the productive sectors. All right, as far as innovation went in this particular industrial revolution, the new source of power was the steam engine, which was invented by James Watt in the 1760s. Great Britain was already in the 1770s and 80s taking large advantage of, or using it to its greatest capacity, and they were industrializing much faster than any other country. By the early 19th century, after the United States had overthrown British rule, they too would start to use the steam engine in a variety of ways, in factories and on steamboats, and for railroads, obviously. The first industry to have factories in the United States was, just as in Britain, the textile industry. The technology came from Britain. A man named Samuel Slater brought the technology for building the first textile factory in the United States in Rhode Island. Samuel Slater had to sneak the technology out of England. England was protecting all of that technology very closely, and they didn't want to allow for competition, right? They didn't want the technology to get out to other countries and then therefore be competition to them. So Samuel Slater brought the technology. Moses Brown had the money and the finances to build the first mill. And again, that first mill was built in what we call today Rhode Island, actually when they called then Rhode Island. In addition, the other innovation that was very important in this early 19th century as far as factories and production goes is the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. It meant that you no longer had to take the seeds out of cotton by hand, and that you could do it through a machine. And that meant you could have laborers doing other things, working in the fields and not pulling seeds out of the cotton, and that they could then increase the production of cotton, and they could put more and more lands into the production of cotton. So with the innovation of the cotton gin, that expanded the cotton industry and lands planted in cotton in the South in particular. And the South then developed what was called the Deep South, those states that are Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So all of the Deep South started to turn their lands over to the production of cotton. The cotton itself had some innovations in it. They went from a long staple cotton, as it was called, that was a little bit more delicate and harder to cultivate, to what was called a short staple cotton that would grow almost anywhere. So it wasn't as sensitive as the long staple cotton. So that's kind of interesting as well. That meant that more lands and more areas could be turned over to cotton production. So there you go. The South has its cotton production, and the North is starting to industrialize, and it is also building its transportation systems. The new innovations in transportation were the steam-powered boat, and also the Erie Canal, obviously. So you should know the Erie Canal, and it was built in 1825. The canal itself is very small. It's not more than 20 feet across and probably 7 or 8 feet deep, but it had the latest locks to get boats up over things and down, well, not so much down the other side, but when they had to go up over, they used a lock system where a boat enters, the lock closes, water fills it, and it can go up to the next level. And that's how locks work. And the Erie Canal had the latest in technology. Remember, it connected the Hudson River with Lake Erie. They also, as we said already, built lots of railroads, 30,000 miles by 1860, and by 1869, I know that's after the Civil War, but they had wanted to link the country together by a transcontinental railroad from beginning of the Civil War forward, and they did finally in 1869. And right along with the railroad, they developed a communication system called the telegraph, and the telegraph lines went up right next to the railroad, and they met at Ogden, Utah. So that's the meeting place of the railroad when it was finally completed, Ogden, Utah. And so the United States had its transcontinental railroad, which meant that transportation or even traveling, you didn't have to go all the way down to or around South America to get to the Pacific Ocean or vice versa back to the Atlantic. You could go across by railroad much quicker. In terms of agriculture, the United States was quickly, and in this early age of industrial revolution, specializing in production of agricultural goods broadly. We'll look at a map in just a second, and you'll see where the agricultural goods were concentrated. But as far as even right now, you can remember that the South is starting to largely grow cotton. So we know that the cotton belt, as it were, the specialization in the growth of cotton will be in the South. But we'll look at the other goods that are produced, agricultural goods that are produced in the United States. The Northwest, like I said earlier, is the important place because that's where immigrant populations were going to come in and around Chicago and the Minnesota, Illinois region and start to cultivate lands that were very agriculturally rich, and they would start to supply New York with all sorts of agricultural goods through the transportation over the Great Lakes into Lake Erie, down through the Erie Canal and down the Hudson River to New York. So that's an important connection. The Northwest will be connected to New York, basically. There were innovations in the production in agriculture. McCormick in the Illinois region invented the reaper, and John Deere invented the plow. So plowing your field up and then harvesting were the two things that these inventions were for. And they meant that harvesting could go on a little bit quicker with the reaper, and that plowing could be a little bit faster and more efficient with John Deere plow. Okay, so not big innovations, but innovations that would allow for the Northwest, once again, to become very productive and then be a desirable source of products for cities like New York that were really just sort of trading posts and markets for international goods and domestic goods. All right, in addition, the first industrial revolution, they built factories. They replaced what was called the putting out system, which meant that the factory owner put the raw materials out to his producers in the countryside. So they would take yarn and thread out to women who were weaving in their own homes, basically. And that's what the putting out system before the factories came into place was. With a factory, though, you could bring everybody into the factory, so the labor came to the place of production. And in the case of the early industrial revolutions, textiles were the first place that they did this. Lowell mills became the model of a textile industry, and they brought in labor usually from the countryside and usually unmarried women who were trying to make a little bit of money before they got married. And that was the idea initially of the Lowell mills. They were expected to be paternalistic in the sense that they laid down rules for these young girls from the countryside to follow, and they were, things like you had to be in at a certain hour of the night, and they had to take care and uphold a moral standard in these mills. You'll find that if you read into it too much, that those standards were not always upheld by everybody in the mills. But in general, right, they were what we call paternalistic, right, that the mill owner was supposed to keep an eye over these young girls that were still unmarried and would soon become wives, but they would try to make money before they got married. In addition to women, they also hired immigrants from Ireland and from Germany. So the immigrants were a big part of the hiring in factories. In both cases, whether it was immigrants or women, factory owners could pay lower wages for that type of labor. So they were working in a market, under market conditions, and so they were hiring the cheapest labor that they could to do factory work, which was not pleasant work. So factories, especially in those days, they're probably, monotonous in our day, but they're safe. In those day and age, they were not safe. They were unsanitary, and the labor tended to be labor and laboring hours could be very long because there wasn't very many restrictions on what factory owners could do. All right, urbanization goes on with this. As we know, we said population centers tended to stay towards the East Coast and tended to stay in cities on the East Coast. But the most urbanization went on, once again, in the North. And again, you want to note this, that the South is not building cities. They're remaining rural and agrarian without industry and without large urban centers, generally speaking. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't any large urban centers in the South. They just didn't grow up as close to each other as they did in the North, right? So the urban centers are growing up on water routes and on railroad routes and on roadway routes, right? So all of those early maps are important because that's where the urban centers grew up and that's where factory towns grew up. So again, in the North we get that growth and that urbanization. In this, we get to a concentration of wealth in a sort of wealthy capitalist class, very much like the Marx would have put it, but he wasn't quite writing, at least at this time. We also see then the growth of really horrible slums, especially around the city areas that served factories, and especially as more and more factories, maybe not in the early 1820s and 30s, but by the 1840s with the big Irish immigration and Germans coming in as well, the slums in the larger cities in the North, like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, started to get quite large, and they were very unhealthy conditions. So laborers were working in unhealthy conditions, and they were going home to very unsanitary houses and conditions in the slums. With this urbanization, though, rose up this middle class ideal in the United States. So the United States had started out as farmers and or plantation owners, and then they developed that Jeffersonian notion of the ideal educated small farming class, and that may have existed to some extent still, but now the ideal was in these large urban areas a middle class existence, and the whole idea that the man went out to earn a living, and so he was a public individual. He interacted with the public, and the woman in the middle class would stay home. And so in your book you'll read a little bit about the cult of domesticity, that she kept the home, she kept the children, she was responsible for the education of the children as well. And so was the realm of a wife and then a woman's place, I guess we would say. And men were then public individuals and went out and earned money for this family unit. And that was the ideal. And then, as always in all times and places, the ideal didn't work out for quite a lot of the population, and especially the poor. But this is, since it says it's a middle class ideal, we'll go with the fact that the poor didn't quite make it to this point. And then finally you want to know that the underclasses in the slums, whether they were white, black, or Irish, there was definitely an underclass. And even in the North they had a black and the Irish underclasses. And the others, white working class, looked down on both of these groups as somehow inferior to them. All right, so this is the last map and the end of our lecture here, but just look quickly at especially the eastern side of the United States and see where all the all the agricultural goods are being grown. And here, just simply on the left-hand side of the legend, you see corn and wheat in an orange color, green for dairy and cattle, tobacco and hemp is in red, and then cotton, the light. So here we can go over to the East Coast and you see all of the southern states here were into cotton, from South Carolina to Georgia to Alabama to Mississippi and to Louisiana, right? And then if you went up, we call the Corn Belt up here, where we have the Cumberland Road and the northern reaches. Dairy cattle and dairy farming is up here in the New York and the New England states. And then for tobacco, the red areas. Remember, they started out with tobacco. It grew well in Virginia, and then as time went on, they grew it as well in Kentucky. And here you can see it. It looks like, yeah, in the Missouri region as well. So that's the tobacco, some of the interesting things. You do have a bit of rice and sugar cane, very rare though, down in Louisiana, a little bit of rice and sugar cane, and then on the very, very coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. All right. You have also on this, we could probably keep going. You can see the dots of things, the important ores and minerals that were mined are the bitumen here, coal and anthracite coal, and then iron ore. Iron ore up here in Pittsburgh is not surprising, right? And then the coal mines all in this region. So lots of coal mines. That meant that the United States had a lot of energy to produce steam and this used for the steam engine. So coal was a very desired product. If you guys wanted to go look over here, we got silver and gold with red stripes, and ta-da, San Francisco, and well, not San Francisco itself, but the Central Valley region was the biggest gold find and the biggest gold what do they call that? A gold vein was found. It's 120 miles long and in the Central Valley or the Sacramento area. So that gold vein went 120 miles to the north. So lots of gold in California. All right, so that's just a little view of industrialization in the north and the growing and largely agrarian south, and then that will be important as we enter into politics and the Western movement, and the U.S. finally erupts into a civil war over slavery and states' rights. All right, so that's the end of this.